Hey, it's me, Nails here. This is going to be my book review video of Frank Herbert's Dune, science fiction's supreme masterpiece. I agree with that statement. I mean, I haven't read a better sci-fi novel. Okay, so there's probably better critics than me out there that have, for in the many decades since this book came out, said much smarter and better articulated things than me about this book. And to be honest, I don't think I have any specific intellectual insights that would be, to add to people, the right audiences getting connected, getting exposed to this material. But I like this book so much. It's one of my all-time favorite books ever. Anyway, so I'm just gonna throw my opinions out there anyway. So anyway, gonna rant. I'm. It's hard to stay on topic or do like a. I don't have time to plan out these reviews, and it's part of my review style for this YouTube channel project. There's an authenticity and improvisation that I really. There's some like raw energy there that just get the right people to find the right books and also maybe get inspired to pick it up based on my enthusiasm for it, and maybe some interesting ideas as well, my interpretations. So anyway, where to begin with Dune? Like, it's gonna be hard not to get distracted. There's so much. A lot of it, a lot of the central ideas and themes are almost in an unexplainable meta mystical way itself, in the very construction and conceptualization and then construction delivery of every aspect of this entity that is Dune. Elicit very timeless ideas and themes typical to all of humanity, like love, responsibility, leadership, ministries, condescension towards less fortunate groups of people, heroism in that regard, I guess, partially revenge, the emotional resonance of that theme, in ways that elicit the imagination with just all the right narrative decisions and writing ability in a way that is so general that it's kind of hard to break down and explain. It's a book that's better for you to just experience yourself and just read. One of the challenges of that is that you can't conceptualize this universe without a lot of pre-existing imagination and good faith. For example, Frank Herbert, he'll write without, like, this book would need a companion encyclopedia 15 times as long as this very long novel, right? To make feasible sense of certain words in the way that they're placed. And yet, the most remarkable thing about it, it almost makes an argument for something like precognition or psionic abilities in human beings generally, because people that have never had a lot of common in the way of communication or otherwise knew each other will read this book without reference to some of the concepts that are brought up in the context of the story, though, through visualization, through things like whatever psionic abilities might exist in people, they conceptualize visually the same things. And it feasibly makes perfect sense because these aspects of this universe are so well imagined. Since I forgot what they were called in the novel, synthetic humans, various future technologies, the way the spice is used for space travel, it's just insinuated the Bene Gesserit, future seers, like so many mystical, like the lines between mysticism and science are so blurred at this level of technological advancement in this future, that through very limited detail in the prose, it just elicits a natural instinctive response for people, not everybody, but most people who read this book, to easily glean or comprehend how, over a certain potential evolution, those anomalies came about, how they exist. For example, the way they power ships, which I imagine faster than light travel, is ethically condemnable. and the process by which that came about is not explained in detail in this book per se, but probably in the expanded universe of Dune. Somebody somewhere or Brian Herbert have elaborated about, or Frank Herbert had world building notes, but I'm not aware of it yet because I haven't had the time to invest in that much in this specific universe. However, the unethical way in which they use the innate capacity of the structuring of the human brain to model whatever subsequent correlated technologies as a sort of control center by using a human soul enhanced with spice to somehow power ships and navigate as well, maybe, is, oddly enough, something that I actually talked about a friend from work about once. Easy enough for me to conceptualize in the general process in a way that my subconscious can barely link with my conscious mind in a more intellectually expanding way, because I wouldn't have thought of it otherwise if it wasn't for like the ideas being placed through the narrative medium, generally speaking. And so the particulars, I'm not an engineer. I don't know. I don't understand how, but I can easily imagine that human beings would use that same structure of how human bodies are designed, for lack of a better word, especially in the neural system, to model aspects of engineering after. I mean, you could say that computers are somewhat an example of that. And so, like, the way that some people look at AI is like that. Like a machine, the way that machines think or seem to think with many processes which are become codependent in time and seemingly self-perpetuating. The difference is that computers have a limit and don't have like creative what's the word, things like will, emotional understanding, creative problem solving, processing, ability to improvise to an extent. It's all very rigid numbers game. So compared to where things might go in the 10,000 year potential future, technologies with then and now, why not? Sometimes there are narrative outcomes that you could imagine and say, well, this feels more like it's modeled after a story, like something that we'd want to see. But it's at that point, it's set so far in the future, taking so many creative liberties with so many specific conditions that it's impossible to argue against simultaneously, paradoxically as well. And this example that I've been giving about how they use human bodies or beings, both enhanced by spice, to navigate, is just one of many examples I could waste a ton of time expounding upon to why this book is a work of imaginative genius. And that's just world building, What the story is really about, the things I enjoy talking about as a critic and as a fan, is even deeper, but on a more humanistic, philosophical level that is almost too generic, especially in regards to my job trying to recommend this book. And it has the rare instance of being fun and deep in that way at the same time, but it's not ethically decisive or determined or spiritually comforting enough for me to say that I recommend in terms of it being ethically sound and inspiring. And so, in other words, Dune is a very morally gray story that every reader is going to draw their own conclusions from, into how much inspiration they're able to take from the main character's story arc and example. Especially in the sequels, as it takes on a more cautionary approach, which is, somewhat fantastorical in the quality that it's based on many instances from history, layered and summarized together. Looking at it without thinking about it, and just as a visceral cinematic experience, like a movie or like some of the movie adaptations, which are pretty good. I've seen them all. You could say it's a fun adventure, but it is, but it's also so much more than that. It seems to me, not to get too weepy or poetic here, but it seems to me to be a very artistic physical embodiment. The book itself is a very artistic physical embodiment of making a proof or an argument for the necessary link between individual willpower and maintaining cohesive social structure. In other words, leadership. It's never easily spelled out if you could isolate any character from any side of the war between Atreides and the Harkonnens, or the Fremen and Atreides versus the Harkonnens, etc., that, one or any of their actions are morally justified. Instead, it's looking somewhat outward and delineating any moral argument for right or wrong on a more like storybook level, letting the readers draw their own conclusions. For all I know, in other words, to put it simply, it could be a lesser evil versus a greater evil, or bad guys versus the bad guys. And yet, it doesn't feel meaningless, because we are getting the insight of a very typical, a human being who is very typical and universally understandable, like a blank slate, as many often large epic space opera or fantasy novels, have their main character who is in extraordinary circumstances and just so happens to have a few extraordinary abilities as well, most of which, in this instance, arrive as a sort of like pressure makes a diamond metaphor scenario, because of the extraordinary responsibilities and circumstances. So, the abilities manifest as a result of his will and as a result of fate. That is very fun to imagine, and it's also very interesting. And more so, the real worth of the story for me, as I've gotten older in the years since I read this, it's more memorable as it applies to how to see your engagement with the human race, generally speaking, as legitimate on a vaguely imagined level of worth and moral validation, as a shield against naturally occurring moral evils and chaos and the competitive nature of wars over resources. Like, for example, if you had a warring nation that at a certain point only existed to perpetuate itself and had lost what Sigmund Freud might call like the ego in place of the id, which to me, the moral patterns and descriptions of the dealings of the Harkonnen house is more closely an example of than the other side of this war in this novel. Who retains the moral high ground? Or is there a redeeming quality to aspects of monarchies and dominance hierarchies, as one famous psychologist I know likes to refer to them, power structures, this sort of thing? Is there any validation for warfare? These are ideas that modern Western audiences, I believe, need to resist potential future tyranny, that all governments of the world have a long, terrible history of perpetuating under different euphemistic disguises for different bullshit moral claims in the heat of the moment that are more often than not, culturally falsely propagandized as appropriate, correct, valid, whatever. And so the best way that humans learn is through parables, symbols, narratives, moral allegories, paradigms. This one is dealing with ethical, universal human dilemmas and questions that are as old as time, in a way that is not restricted to just one nation's current political ideologies or contrasting ideologies, so it's much more universal than that. But at the same time, a caution and a criticism, it can be very depressing and morally perplexing as well, because it creates a sense of darkness and hopelessness and bleakness at what is required for any argument that any meaning or moral validation exists at all, in comparison to human beings' nature, which by nature human beings are conquerors. They are gonna wage war for resources to and competition and do war crimes and unethical things to other competing groups in order to perpetuate their own cause. And that's very depressing, especially considering the conditions that it took for this series of competing emperors and empires and great houses and such. All of what is insinuated is a repeat of past human history that is very far away from utopian, much darker, more realistic. Some readers will be more immersed for that reason. Others will be more so disgusted or depressed that they just won't have the emotional fortitude to learn from it or try to look at the glass half full, so to say, for any redeeming arguments for the sort of heightened individuality or need for force, sometimes tactical violence, that this book makes the argument a very strong argument for. And if it wasn't able to universally resonate so much emotional appeal by so many otherwise unrelated audience members across many nations in the real world since 1960s, I wouldn't say that it does, but the proof is out there, based on many people's claims and the fans of this universe, this book series, this book. So yeah, it seems so. In other words, it tends to ask more questions than it answers, and like it's a double-edged sword. It's so brutally foundational to what moves a lot of us as a cause in life for humanity, like the pursuit of like what might be a self-actualization at the top of the psychologist Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so to say. If it comes as a result of fighting against the natural order of the universe, which is never-ending competition and war over resources and such. But at what point does that determine, moral validation and meaning and other things like philosophical, like humanism and etc., transhumanism, like going above and beyond and becoming like more than a man, more than a god. I mean, more than a man and becoming like a god, or I should say more than a man or a woman, because it's not restricted to gender. The main character just so happens to be male. So I guess it can be kind of heavy and morally perplexing and depressing in some ways, but also it seems like one of those necessary evils. I don't know, but it's definitely a book that doesn't go too far with romantic fantasy at all. The only unrealistic creative liberties it takes is how certain plot developments unfold, especially regarding Paul's sister by the end is just kind of so unexplained and vague, like how exactly that turned out. That arc, it just seemed kind of forced and it kind of took me out of the story a little bit. That's like the only memorable quality of the narrative that I felt was storybook-like and unrealistic. And besides one other, some of these certain scenes could have been fleshed out a little more nuanced, less like a play, like a Greek play or something, like a Greek tragedy, which, I mean, some people will like that classy aspect to it, if you could say. But most of that audience has been dead for thousands of years. So, or evolved and taken a new form. So anyway, yes, Dune is great and terrible. It is a powerful book. It's morally questionable. It will make you ask questions. It is visually dazzling, emotionally and imaginatively provocative. It is inspiring depending on your moral character. You'll do a lot of projecting of qualities of things. The world building is interesting about ideas. It can be inspiring towards aspects of innovation. It is a book that it outside of just science fiction, it is one of the masterpiece works of literature in human history. I argue. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. It is a challenge. It is not appealing in every perfect way. but its greatness is indisputable in my opinion. So yeah, this is my most. I could analyze various aspects of this book and its construction, and praise it and criticize it and speculate on its themes and arguments and the world building and so many details, and for tens of hours, believe me, I could. So this is my most generalized short summary that you'll ever hear, but this is one of my favorite books of all time. I mostly made this video just for fun, to keep practicing my critic style. So anyway, hopefully it wasn't too boring. It's hard to make these videos like entertaining when you care this much about the content that a lot of these stories represent, especially with science fiction fantasy novels that really have rocket launched my imagination and give me a lot of emotional motivation in my life. And remembering what they meant to me at the time when I read them, and helped me inspire me to look for opportunities to gain experiences in the real world that help shape me into who I am now, ultimately the kind of person I am at this present moment. It's really, really hard to deliver anything of worthy content without getting super serious, and that tone makes for a lot of boring banter, and I'm sorry about that. Like I try to be an artist, I try to be entertaining, but it's so hard to do so many things when you're working with material of such profound substance that deserves accurate praise. What else can I say? I'm stumped I've been stumped in my ability to make a book review video about this book for half a year. I procrastinated it. I made one, and I made another one, and I made another one, and so yeah. Send me your recommendations for good science fiction, please. More book reviews later. I'm going to read Dune Messiah soon for the first time. And by soon, I mean within the next 10 years for sure. Because I have a lot of books that I'm working on. So, and a lot of other things outside of just reading in my life that I'm working on. So, yes, thanks for listening. Now go conquer the galaxy.